Buonasera, buonasera, everyone. Hello, 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 one and all. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hold it, folks. I'm getting the chat open as we speak. Again, if you'd like to write in, let us know where you are, how you're doing, how things are going in general. That's what I'm here for. Berkeley, California. Big buonasera to you. Bon pomeriggio. Carmel, California. Mill Valley, California. Bedford, New York. There's that landslide. Boston, Massachusetts, Houston, Texas, Detroit, Michigan, Wellesley, Mass, Jamestown, New York, Middlebury, Vermont. A gin and tonic welcome from Johns Creek, Georgia. With a big Scottish apple juice. Buonasera to you from East Greenwich, Rhode Island. Brooklyn, New York. Happy Friday from Powell, Ohio. Bradenton, Florida. Rumford, Rhode Island. Bethesda, Maryland. Baltimore, Maryland. Boca Raton. Buonasera to you as well. Bethel, Maine, Pompano Beach, Florida, Solana Beach, California, Palo Alto, California, Plantation, Florida, Lexington, Kentucky, little break there in that Florida monotony. Portland, Maine, Madison, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., Alpharetta, Georgia, Rockville, Maryland, Woodbridge, Virginia, Boulder, Colorado, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Alpharetta again, Amherst, New Hampshire, Canton, Mass, Fairfax, Virginia. Big grazie to you as well. Aventura, Florida, White Plains, New York, Oakland, California, Rye, New York, Bethesda, Maryland, Sherman, Connecticut, Los Angeles, California, Ocala, Florida, Miller Place, New York, Worcester, Massachusetts, where I went to undergrad. I was at Holy Cross 3 years, actually. I was in Italy for one. Pepper Pike, Ohio, New Jersey, Williamsburg, Michigan, Siesta Key, Florida, Keene, New Hampshire, Redwood Shores, California, Del Mar, California, Killingworth, Connecticut, Nokomis, Florida. Hello to you as well. Dayton, Ohio, Hobart, Australia, down under. Big welcome to all of our friends in Australia. Northfield, Illinois, sunny San Diego, Hollywood, Florida, Larchmont, New York. Where are we? Niagara, Ontario, Canada, wine country. And in fact, high quality wine country indeed. East Hampton, New York, excuse me. East Hampton, New York. Where are we? Santiago, Chile. A big welcome to our Chilean friends. Brooklyn, New York, Beverly Hills, Tusico, Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, Menlo Park, California. Okay, we're over 300, so we're about halfway there, folks. Another minute or two. Laurel Canyon, California, Port Chester, New York. The haircut situation. You know, I finally got the haircut, Martin, and nobody noticed because it wasn't much of a haircut. Again, you have to go easy with a new barber. Don't tell him I told you that. But I just kind of let him take a little bit off because I wasn't certain. And to make it worse, I actually then spoke to my barber in Florence. Fortunately, we spoke without visuals. He didn't see that I cheated on him. Los Angeles, sorry, Manhattan. Costa Paradiso in Sardinia, Magari. Johnston, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, Bethany Beach, Delaware, New Britain, Connecticut, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, beautiful downtown Gainesville, Virginia, Sharon, Pennsylvania, Weston, Florida. A hero from your current novel comes from 15th century Siena. Fantastic. Bogota, Colombia, Princeton, New Jersey, Raleigh, North Carolina, Arlington, Virginia. Someone did notice I got a haircut. Thank you very much. Fantastic. All right, folks, just another minute or two. Oh, it's 5:05. We should actually get started here. Orangevale again, woohoo, twice. Arlington, Virginia as well. Folks, a big welcome to all of you. I'm going to get started simply because we have a lot to talk about. To try to kind of get all of Siena in one lecture is a daunting task. So let us begin. A big benvenuti to all of you who have joined me this Friday evening. Many of you are writing in saying that this has become kind of tradition now, that every Friday you spend your evenings with me. Well, I'm spending my evenings with you, so it is fantastic. And let us begin by taking an aerial view here of the city of Siena. And if you remember from my lecture last week, talking about the greatness of Tuscany, I actually mentioned that you can very clearly see that when Siena was in fact organized from an urbanistic perspective in the 13th and 14th centuries, they had a very clear mind to essentially separate, right, the notions of church and state, at the very least on a visible kind of urbanistic level. And so obviously all things religious here at the cathedral and all things civic there instead over at the Palazzo Pubblico and its surrounding piazza. that Siena has maintained its medieval character in an extraordinarily authentic way. In fact, just a very look at the city kind of throws you back hundreds of years and almost suggests what it would have been like to have lived in this hill town some 700 years ago when it was at the peak of its political and economic power. You see how all these buildings kind of cluster right up and cradle that cathedral at the very top. And that Siena, in fact, is a hill town, or as I corrected myself, a hills town, right? Topographically, Siena is built up on a series of 3 hills, and the highest of the hills is reserved for the most important monument in the city, which is its great cathedral. And you can also see this beautiful countryside that surrounds the city itself. When you approach Siena, it really is a moment of inspiration and a breathtaking beauty as well. Right? Now, the Cathedral of Siena, dedicated like nearly all cathedrals to the BVM, to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And of course, the other name that you hear for this structure will be Duomo. And as I've told you time and time again, that word Duomo has nothing to do with dome, okay, despite the fact that the cathedral does in fact have a dome covering its crossing space. Remember, that word Duomo is simply a nickname for a cathedral, regardless of whether it has a dome or not. Now, construction, you see, begins in the year 1226. And another important rule of thumb for all of you to follow: find out when a European city builds its cathedral, and you've pretty much pinpointed the high point of that city's economic history. You don't start building these things unless you have the money to back it up. And consider that the completion of Siena Cathedral took the better part of 3/4 of a century. That Siena Cathedral is one of the most successfully Gothic in style cathedrals in all of Italy, along with Milan Cathedral and Orvieto Cathedral as well. And the sense of continuity that we have from the outside of Siena Cathedral with its interior space. So in fact, if the exterior is decorative, the inside seems to be even more. Now, as most of you know, I am an early 15th century Renaissance architecture guy. So for me, less is much, much more. And when I walk into Siena Cathedral, my head spins from the sheer overwhelming quantity of decoration. And in art history, the expression that we use to kind of define this notion of decorating every square inch of floor and wall and ceiling surface is horror vacui. Horror like a horror movie, which is the Latin word for fear, vacui, empty spaces. And so the idea that technically it almost appears as if the architects were afraid of leaving any space empty and so decided to cover it instead. But if you think about it, this quantity of decoration and quality as well, because it is quite striking, essentially renders Siena Cathedral a successful cathedral. Because if the point of building one of these things is to demonstrate a city's devotion to the BVM, to the Virgin Mary, then it doesn't take an art historian to realize that this city has a very particular relationship with her. And the reason, not surprisingly, derives from the rivalry between Siena and, of course, neighboring Florence. I mentioned this to you last week, that technically speaking, because they were so close, they were constantly fighting for territory and became sort of great rivals. Now, what you're looking at on the left-hand side, that shield divided horizontally between white and black fields, is the national flag of the medieval city-state of Siena, called the Balsana. It is to Siena what, let's say, the stars and stripes are to the United States of America, to the maple leaf is to Canada, what the tricolor red, white, and green is to Italy, right? Because remember, they're their own independent sovereign states at this time. The origins of the colors come from the foundation myth of the city of Siena. I mentioned last week that Siena, because it is a hill town, in fact, was pre-Roman in origin. It was probably founded by the Etruscans. But of course, the Sienese in the Middle Ages, when the city was such an important European player, was looking for a more impressive pedigree. That is, looking for some connection back to ancient Rome. And very often in history, what we find is that if you cannot find the evidence or proof that you need, you very simply make it up. And that, in fact, is what happened in 14th century Siena, when city officials claimed to have discovered a document proving that their ancestry went all the way back to ancient Rome. Well, not to Romulus, because that role is already taken. We all know what happens to Romulus and how he founds the great monarchy, turned republic, turned empire. So instead, the Sienese maintain that their ancestry goes back to Remus, to the defunct brother. And that supposedly before Romulus slew his brother, Remus had actually fathered two sons, and one of those sons fled north from the Aventine Hill to get away from his nasty homicidal uncle, and decided to settle down in an area that topographically reminded him of home, because Siena would be built up on 3 hills, and Rome, of course, is built up on 7. But because he was such a young man, this young son of Remus, whose name was Senus, S-E-N-U-S, which is the Latin for Siena, was protected by the gods, lowercase g plural, by a white cloud, a magical cloud that made him invisible to his enemies during the day, and a black magical cloud that made him invisible to his enemies at night, until he could grow up, come of age, and then found the great city of Siena. That's where the colors come. On the right, the red fleur-de-lis on the white backdrop is, of course, the flag of the city-state of Florence. And this great rivalry, which was at its peak around the year 1300. In fact, what happened in the middle of the 13th century is that Florence joined forces with another Tuscan city named Arezzo. It's about 50 kilometers south of Florence. And they put their armies together and marched down on the city of Siena, prepared to attack and to take the city. And Siena simply didn't stand a chance because they were greatly outnumbered by this force. Florentine ambassadors entered into Siena and were negotiating terms of unconditional surrender, when suddenly, in the middle of all this, a Sienese man by the name of Bonaguida Lucari, who is a legend in the city of Siena. He is the Sienese version of John Adams in American history. He stood up, he stopped the negotiations, and look, instead of surrendering like cowards, let us go down fighting. And he convinces the Sienese, and I'm quoting here, to put their fate into the hands of the Queen and Empress of Eternal Light, aka the BVM. The Sienese rally around Lucari's war cry. They throw out the Florentine ambassadors. They have a very important ceremony, right, where essentially they carry the keys of the city of Siena through the streets into the cathedral then being built, and they gave those keys to a painting of the Virgin Mary. And in every version of this event, you actually see Mary reaching out of the painting and taking those keys. At that moment, in the year 1260, Siena actually saw itself as espoused, as married to the Virgin Mary. After the ceremony, they start beating their war drums, they throw open the city gates, and they rush out to meet certain defeat. And instead, perhaps the greatest military upset in medieval warfare. At the Battle of Montaperti in the year 1260, not only did the Sienese win and thrash the Florentine and Aretine forces, supposedly it was such a one-sided victory for them that Sienese women were beating up Florentine men with cooking utensils. The Battle of Montaperti is the single greatest historical event in Siena's history. Right? And consider that if you visit Siena anytime soon and you ask one of the locals, try an old timer because they get particularly emotional. Hey, what happened at Montaperti that day? They get very riled up. Yeah, we really licked them Florentines that time. Folks, this is a battle that took place 760 years ago. But for the Sienese, it might as well have happened yesterday. And for me, one of the most extraordinary phenomenon that you can see is when the Sienese soccer team is actually good enough to be playing in the Serie A, the Italian Premier League, which means that they play against Florence. If Siena is up on Florence during a soccer match, the Sienese fans begin chanting, "Remember Montaperti," essentially saying, we kicked your asses that time and we're kicking your asses again. It is such a deeply entrenched and rooted rivalry between these cities. And that Battle of Montaperti is just something that lives in eternity in the collective soul of the city of Siena. Now, this charming painting is, in fact, the painting to which Siena gave the keys in 1260, known appropriately as the Madonna degli Occhi Grossi, or the Madonna of the Big Eyes, for pretty apparent reasons. In fact, these holes that you see in the painting were once the holes that accommodated precious stones and gems and what have you as well. Now, consider that, like most married couples, which periodically renew their marriage vows, so too did the city of Siena renew its. But every 25 years or so, they would reenact that ceremony where they gave the keys of the city to the Virgin Mary. And the third version to which the keys were given is the one you're looking at right here, right? Duccio's famous painting of the Maest. In fact, the title of this webinar, right, Medieval Majesty, comes from this word Maest, which means majesty in Italian. And this is more than just your run-of-the-mill Madonna and Child. This is a much more majestic, as its name would suggest, rendering of it, because it's huge. This painting is enormous today and was even more so when it was first painted in 1308. This is a hypothetical reconstruction. We don't know exactly what the frame of the Maest looked like, but we do know that that painting I was just showing you was nothing more than the central panel of a much larger altarpiece. This painting sat on the high altar of Siena Cathedral and was about 5 meters tall by about 4.6 meters in width. So about 16 by 15 feet in size. It was once the largest altarpiece ever painted in Italian art. Right? And in fact, I have this personal theory. Those of you who took my Italian art and architecture class may remember that this painting actually served as the rood screen, the dividing screen that all Catholic churches had, separating the clergy from the laity inside. And if this is what the front may have looked like, this is what the back looks like today. 26 scenes depicting the Passion of Jesus Christ. In fact, any of you interested in joining me for my latest online course, Antiquity of the Medici, one of the lectures is going to be dedicated to putting these Duccio paintings right next to Giotto and Scrovegni chapel paintings as well. And Duccio versus Giotto is roughly the equivalent of Batman versus Superman from an art historical perspective, technically speaking. This is the panel that you see today. This is what it may have looked like originally. This, again, is a hypothetical reconstruction. And these blank spaces that you see are lost pieces of the Maest. But many of these pieces, in fact, what happened is that in the 18th century, the powers that be in Siena decided to sell the painting off. But because there aren't too many people with living rooms large enough to accommodate 17 by 16 foot paintings, what they did was to dismember it. They took it apart and they sold off pieces individually. So here in the United States, there are 2 predella pieces this is one of them for certain, I can't remember what the other one is, in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The Raising of Lazarus down here is in the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. The Frick collection in New York has a piece of the Maest as well. So the painting was very literally dismembered, technically speaking, but it stands, again, as testimony and as proof of this very particular relationship that Siena had with the Virgin Mary. Consider, by the way, that after that victory at Montaperti, Siena would adopt an acronym to represent its sense of the commune, much like the ancient Romans did. If you remember back to my Rome Eternal City webinars, where essentially the Romans identified themselves with the letters SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome. In Siena, that acronym instead was CSCV, Communis Senis Civitas Virginis, the commune of Siena, the city of the Virgin. That is how the city identified itself from a civic perspective, right? That she was the queen. Now, what happens? Okay, once the Maest was completed, once it was placed on the high altar, the Opera, or the building committee of Siena Cathedral, had to address another issue. And that was where to build their baptistry, right? And you remember from last week, in Tuscany, tradition was to build baptistries in an anterior position. In other words, in front of the church. Problem in Siena is that you can't do that, because that building right there is the Hospital of Santa Maria della Scala. It is an 800-year-old hospital, which is one of the largest structures. In fact, what you're looking at here is just the tip of the iceberg. This structure continues down against the slope of the hill for thousands and thousands of square meters. And essentially, it was almost as important as the cathedral itself, because the road that passes directly in front of Siena Cathedral is part of the Via Francigena, which was the main pilgrimage highway, right, running essentially all the way down the Italian peninsula and to the city of Rome. And each year, thousands of pilgrims would come through, and they would need a place where they could spend the night. They need a place where they could get food. They need a place where they get medicinal care. And that is exactly what the ospedale, which is where we get that word hospital from, offered them. It offered them hospitality. We can't build it there. So where are we going to build the baptistry here? They decide to do something quite unusual, and that is to build the baptistry behind and below the cathedral proper. Siena Cathedral, positioned on top of a hill, they carve against the slope of the hill, clear out some land, and then build into the subsequent cavity that they create. This probably explains it better than I just did. This is the front of the church that we have been discussing. This is the back. And you can see in the section here that that is the baptistry underneath. In other words, what they did, imagine the slope of the hill coming down like this. They carve into it, build their baptistry, and actually enlarge the original church. These two bays, oops, sorry about that. These two bays are actually part of an extension that was added onto the cathedral proper. You see it in the plan here. This and this add 10 meters onto the cathedral in the early 1300s. They built their baptistry between 1319 and 1325, and they extend the cathedral over the top of it. Now, why are they making their cathedral bigger? Why are they increasing the size of their brand new cathedral from 70 meters, which is the length to this point, to this new 80-meter length? Well, the answer, by the way, here's the backside. Here's the facade of that cathedral that you see when you're looking up at the backside. The answer is because of what was happening in Florence. In other words, while Siena Cathedral was just being finished up, while Siena Cathedral was actually beginning to build its baptistry, they heard that 40 miles up the road, Florence was beginning the construction of its cathedral. And that Florence explicitly, publicly claimed that they were about to begin the construction of the largest cathedral in all of Tuscany. So by increasing the length of their church, the Sienese are taking preemptive measures. In other words, 70 meters is really big for a church in the 13th century. Now it's 80 meters. And what they're betting on is just how big can Florence Cathedral possibly be? Well, what happens is just as they're finishing up the construction of their baptistry, the part of Florence Cathedral that was being built was the bell tower, the campanile, which tradition attributes to the great painter Giotto. Right? And when they got a sense of how large this bell tower was going to be, it also then gave them a point of reference for how large the cathedral was going to be. In other words, they saw the bell tower and said, God, if that's just the bell tower, this church is going to be absolutely enormous. And they realized in the city of Siena that that 10-meter addition simply would not suffice. And so what they do is to knock through the wall of their brand new church, upon which they've worked for the last 3/4 of a century, and they essentially begin enlarging by building a whole new nave or longer arm. Most churches have a cross shape with a new south-facing facade. And had they completed this structure from front to back, its total length would have measured 140 meters in length, twice the original length of the cathedral up to this point, and making it by far, for its day, in the 14th century, the largest church in all of Christendom. They start building this Duomo Nuovo, that's what they call it, in 1339, and in a 9-year period, they nearly completed it. And we know they nearly finished it because, look, they actually began vaulting, V-A-U-L-T. A vault is a ceiling or a roof covering. And when you build the walls, and the last thing you do is to cover those walls. And when you're reading a floor plan or a ground plan, these X marks that you see over the bays indicate that those spaces were actually covered. So if they're vaulting, that means they're very close to finishing. But then disaster strikes. And doesn't just strike Siena, it strikes all of Europe in the form of the mother of all plagues. That's right, the Black Death, dun, 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 right? Which wipes out about 50% of the population of Siena. Population fell from 60,000 people to 30,000 people in just under 3 years. Right? But the staggering statistic about Siena is that the population today, in 2020, is 60,000 people. It's taken that city 7 centuries to get its demographic levels back to what they were before the Black Death. The Black Death was, for Siena, the proverbial nail in the coffin. They were on the brink of greatness. They were right. I mean, this is like Sputnik. This is like, Soviet Union versus United States, Florence versus Siena, building the cathedral bigger, and then the Black Death just took the knees out of the city, and Siena never, ever recovered. Right? And paradoxically, what happened in Florence is the exact opposite. The city would simply explode after the Black Death because it kind of needed a weeding. And what could have been the biggest church in the Christian world ends up becoming perhaps the most historic parking lot that you will ever visit. And the remains of this Duomo Nuovo, the side aisle of which is clearly visible over here on the left-hand side. In fact, it was such a large church that the Cathedral Museum, inside of which Duccio's Maestà is located, is the brick building that you see here. It's so big you can fit a museum into 3 of its bays, technically. And then from this pier to this white marker is the width of the nave. And then from this white marker to the white one that you see here is the width of the corresponding side aisle on the other side. An absolutely massive structure, which today instead sits like a rotting architectural carcass in Siena as testimony to its almost greatness in its realization. All right, let's now change gears. Let's move south and east from the cathedral complex over to the Piazza del Campo and the Palazzo Pubblico that you see. Right? Now, this building has always served and still does today as City Hall in Siena. That's what its name means, the public palace. And the public palace was a very different, that's not the correct word. It was a very new entity. They never built public palaces before, because if you do a quick survey of Europe around the year 1300, what you discover is that from a political perspective, monarchy was the norm and democracy was the exception. England had a king, France had a king, Germany had an emperor. Most of Italy, remember, Italy was divided up. The Pope was king through the central portion. We had the King of Naples in the south. We have the Duke of Milan up north. Monarchy was the norm. And so in these medieval republics like Siena and Florence and Lucca and Genova and Venice per se, they had to invent a new architectural vocabulary to express these new civic ideas of democracy. And the idea, of course, here in Siena was the more effective and ordered everything seemed, the more effective and ordered this brand new democratic government would be as well. So when construction on City Hall begins in 1297, the new government, the executive council of which consisted of 9 guys, right? The Council of the 9, they were elected into office, and their term of office lasted 2 months. Very, very short term limits, simply because, again, we're coming from oligarchy into democracy, and they'll take the inefficiency of such short terms to counterplay the risk, of course, of going back to an oligarchy later on. And this new government begins passing zoning laws regarding the buildings surrounding City Hall in this public space. All the buildings built around it need to be constructed with the same building material, which is brick. And that's one of my favorite things about Siena. One of my favorite things about Italy, you've heard me say this time and time again, is that they build with the most readily available building material, and the earth around Siena is very rich in clay, this reddish clay. So you just dig it up, bake it, and then build with it. So they want uniformity of material, brick buildings all around, and they also want uniformity of design. They want all the buildings in the piazza to incorporate the same window type as City Hall, which is a tri-4-8 window. It is a single window bay divided into 3 spaces by a pair of columns. Now you're all thinking to yourselves, why do I care about tri-4-8 windows? Well, when you come to Florence, they are bi-4-8 windows. So there are architectural details that are geographically specific to where you are. So they want uniformity of design, they want uniformity of material. But you look at the piazza and you say, well, what the hell happened? Everything's different. What happened is 700 years of time. And of course, expected modifications made to the buildings in the piazza. Right? Now, the piazza itself, which has been described as the most beautiful in all of Italy, and I think that is a perfectly fair assessment. Very few urban spaces have the same breathtaking quality as the Piazza del Campo, which has this natural Greek theater feeling to it because it does slope down. You know, they build it against the slope of the hill. And so what happens, let me go back here, is that the Palazzo Pubblico becomes the proscenum, that permanent backdrop typical of Greek theaters, where the Sienese would watch political and civic life unfold in front of them, almost in a very kind of theatrical way. Not to mention the fact that the piazza is broken up into 9 triangular sections, essentially reflecting the power of the 9, the Council of the 9, radiating out of City Hall throughout the entire space. And my favorite detail of all is that the radius of the piazza is almost perfectly equal to the height of the tower from which this photo is taken. So there is a 1-to-1 or nearly 1-to-1 proportion between plan and elevation. There's this almost intuitive sense of order and control. And remember, the more ordered and controlled this public space seems, the more ordered and controlled and effective the government that commissioned all of it seems as well. There's a marketing ploy going on here in the architecture that's actually being built. This is what the piazza looks like under normal circumstances. This is what it looks like during Palio time, right? I spent some time talking about the horse race last week, and again, broke my heart that both of them were canceled this year for the first time since World War II. But some 50,000 people crammed in to watch 10 horses ride bareback clockwise around the piazza. 3 laps. I think the longest race or the shortest race was 1:23 or something like that. 1 minute and 23 seconds. It happens in the blink of an eye. Now, just let me do this again for all of you who are new to the Palio. This is what it looks like under normal circumstances. And then when it's Palio time, they cover the entirety of that flagstone gray perimeter of the space with dirt. And they transform the medieval piazza into a racetrack. It's just something breathtaking to see. Just the transformation itself is almost incredible. And then to actually watch the race take place is something of another world almost as well. Right? Now, the building itself, and I want to just talk about the architecture with its tripartite arrangement. Right? You can clearly see that essentially there is a central tallest section and then 2 shorter flanking. Right? Each section represents a particular branch of Sienese medieval communal government. It's democracy broken up into 3 branches. And I love asking my undergraduates when we're standing out in the square to guess what those 3 branches might be. They, of course, look at me and you hear crickets in the background, and then one of them musters up the courage to say judicial. Exact. In other words, in the United States, we sort of pride ourselves on imagining that we came up with this notion of judicial, legislative, and executive, when in reality, that is a concept that goes all the way back to the inventors of democracy, to the Greeks. Right? The idea essentially that the branches kind of keeping the others in check. Right? And so this eastern, in Siena, they call each section a torrione. Torre is the Italian word for tower. One is a majorative suffix. It makes the noun to which you attach it maggiore. It makes it bigger. So torrione would translate as big tower. Big, not because they're tall, big because they cover quite a bit of space. And the easternmost torrione on the Palazzo Pubblico was the seat of judicial power, called the Torrione del Podestà. And the Podestà was the title that these medieval communes gave to their supreme judge, who, by the way, had to remain inside of the building for the entirety of his term in an attempt to prevent corruption, because they thought if he left, he might be corrupted by people on the outside. The tallest central Torrione instead represents, and I know you're all thinking executive, but in reality, it's legislative. And the reason is because, again, we've just come off of an oligarchy. And the last thing we want to do is even to suggest putting too much power in the hands of too few people. So this was the Torrione del Gran Consiglio, the Tower of the Great Council, which housed Siena's medieval parliament, consisted of some 300 men, which for a city of 60,000 is a pretty good chunk of the population. And then the real Tower of Power is here, the Western Torrione, which was known as the Torrione dei Nove, the Tower of the Nine, because this is technically where all of the major decisions were made. And so this represents the executive branch of government. Now let us go inside, because the inside of Palazzo Pubblico, for me, is one of the most astounding things that you can see in Italy. Those of you who've been with me in Italy know that I very rarely step foot in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And the reason I don't go in is because all of the art in there was added by the Medici after they became monarchs of the city. And all of the original medieval art was destroyed or covered over. Whereas Palazzo Pubblico in Siena has survived almost intact with its original decoration. And this is important because remember, this is a new venue for artists. They've never created art for civic venues before because there was no civic before the establishment of these republics. And the room that you're in here, the room of the Great Council, is where that parliament would meet. The 300 guys would cram in. And that mural on the eastern end of the room is one of the most important paintings in the history of art. Simone Martini's Maestà. So this is another Madonna in Majesty image, but painted by another artist named Simone Martini. And this time in a civic setting. And this is important because we begin to see some important changes take place. That painting by Duccio that I showed you a few moments ago sat on the high altar of Siena Cathedral. And of course, you almost imagine people on their knees, pounding their chest, saying mea culpa in front of it, this iconic object of reverence. Now, the religious subject in a civic setting, we start to see a little interaction taking place. Because look, baby Jesus has actually struggled to his feet, and he has this scroll in his left hand, which is an actual piece of parchment glued to the wall. And upon the scroll are the words, "Judge diligently, ye who rule the earth." Jesus Christ himself is admonishing the people in this room to do their job well, almost as if it were a divine responsibility. 30 figures surrounding the two of them, just like we saw in Duccio's painting. But in this case, there are many more saints than there are angels in this retinue around Mary. And the reason is because a secular setting deserves historical people. And saints presumably were real people. Angels instead pertain to another realm. And the amazing thing about this particular image is the fact that there is now direct interaction between the people in the room and the painting itself. And that interaction occurs through the words that are spelled out in golden letters on that first step of the throne. They're down here. I know you can't read them, but they read, translated, "The angelic flowers, comma, roses and lilies, comma, of the heavenly meadow, delight me not more than does the good counsel." This is the Virgin Mary speaking to the people in the room. She says the angelic flowers, specifically mentioning roses and lilies, that come from the heavenly meadow. In other words, if they were roses and lilies from heaven itself, they delight me not more than does good counsel. And essentially, she's telling the people in this room to forget about, solemn processions, forget about 10 dozen roses. She doesn't want these trite offerings. What she wants from the people in this room is one thing, that they do their job well. And there's kind of a play on words because Mary wants buon consiglio from the gran consiglio. She wants good counsel from the great council. And this is the equivalent, of course, my undergrads never get this, but it's that big Uncle Sam poster, "I want you," right, during US war efforts or what have you, because Big Sister is up on the wall and Big Sister's telling everyone in this room, "I'm watching you." There is a divine responsibility here in this particular context of the civic. So if Duccio's Maestà was the religious subject in the religious setting, this painting is the religious subject in the civic setting. Of course, the next step in the evolution of art, and folks, this is really important, believe it or not, is civic subject matter in a civic setting, right? Because there was no civic, there's no reason for it. And so a lot of you I know who visited Italy at a certain point get a little disgruntled because Christian subject matter had the monopoly on art for so long. Well, now all of a sudden, wait a second, we have a new market, and that market is a secular one, right? With the idea of sort of civic virtue as the morale of it all. So the room that we're in is the room of the nine. This is medieval Siena's Oval Office. This is where all the major decisions were made. And the frescoes on the walls were painted some 700 years ago by this extraordinary artist named Ambrogio Lorenzetti. And it is essentially an illustration of, as the title would suggest, good government. It tells us what the ingredients are for good government and what the subsequent consequences would be on this wall and this wall. And then on the opposite wall, we have the allegory of bad government and what the subsequent consequences would be there. So that as these 9 are making all these decisions, they can literally, this didactic diagram of what good and bad government are and what the results will be as well around them. All right, now let us take a look because I think it's important to pull this apart, particularly right now in the United States. You know, what is the recipe? What is the formula for good government? Well, good government starts up here in the upper left-hand corner, where we have this ensemble that begins with sapientia. It begins with wisdom. Wisdom is essentially the sort of beginning of it all, and she supports this scale, the plates of which are balanced by this woman in red below her, who represents justice. She is Justitia, and she keeps the plates equal, level. And upon each plate is a different form of justice. On the left here, we have the figure in red who is beheading one man while crowning another. She is distributive justice. And so the idea of the just distribution of reward and punishment. To the other side in white, we have commutative justice. And that idea essentially of not this, how should I put this? I don't want to call it, it's not socialism in that sense, but it's this greater equality amongst citizens. It's not that disparity between the extremely rich and the extremely poor. And then the ropes coming down from those plates that are united in the hand of this woman in gray, who is identified as concordia. Right? Concordia is accordance, agreement. And she has a carpenter's plane on her lap. And so the idea, I love the puns in this particular fresco cycle. When people are in disagreement, concordia smooths things over, which is exactly what a carpenter does with his particular tool. She hands the rope over to this gentleman here in blue, who is the first of a procession of 24 men, because before the 9, before the Great Council, the ancestral form of communal government in Siena consisted of a council of 24 men. They bring that rope all the way up, and then that rope is attached to the base of a scepter held by this gentleman who's dressed half white, half black, okay, with a shield in his left hand upon which is an image of the Virgin Mary, because the Virgin Mary protects. And around his head, the letters CSCV, the Commune of Siena, the City of the Virgin. This figure is the personification of the city of Siena. Right? And above his head are those 3 supreme virtues which should govern any good government. So good government needs to be virtuous first and foremost. Okay? From a moralistic perspective, there cannot be any vice in good government. At least they should not try to have any vice. And so here are those virtues of faith, of love, and of hope, the 3 theological virtues hovering up above. And then surrounding him, 3 to the left and 3 to the right, are his 6, let's say, temporal virtues, less important, cardinal virtues as well, sort of like a cabinet to a president here in the United States. And the first of those virtues is right here on the far left-hand side, the Betty Boop bombshell, who is identified as PAX, Pax or peace. And you notice that she has an olive branch in her left hand, olive branch crown on her head. But what is most surprising is the transparent gossamer that she wears. Now, the slide does not render this successfully, but you can see right through that. And believe me, in the 14th century, the censors would have been in an uproar. Right? But, well, you know, the idea that this is secular subject matter, so we're going to get a bit more license, right, in terms of what we can actually do. And, you know, the question is, why does she look so seductive and appealing? Well, I think it's another pun. Do we not all desire? Do we all not want peace? And so you actually get this sense of an almost physical, attractive quality of the figure, who rests on a cushion underneath which is armor. And you see her feet are on a shield. Now, this has been interpreted in different ways. Some people saying that this is peace, obviously suppressing war and the instruments of war. Others instead saying, no, this is essentially the idea that in order to maintain peace, sometimes you need war. Okay, next to her, the virtue of fortitude. Good government needs to be strong, reliant. Next to her, prudence. And prudence is represented as a woman with a scroll upon which the words past, present, and future are written. Because if you're prudent, you study the past to make informed decisions in the present to positively affect the future. Right? That's what you want from your government. You want magnanimitas, you want magnanimity, you want generosity. Literally, magna anima, greatness of the soul, but in this case, it's a financial generosity because there was once a pan here with gold coins upon her lap. You want a government that is temperate, and this is the virtue of temperance. Takes its time, not rash, not hasty, but taking time to make careful decisions because they understand the implications of the consequences. And then again, justitia, justice appearing for the fourth time. So obviously the key ingredient to any good government is justice. And she sits with a sword in her right hand, disembodied head on her leg, and a crown on her left leg. All right. Now, if you take all this stuff and you combine it and what have you, what essentially results is the consequences of good government that appear on the wall perpendicular to the one I just showed you. Now, it's an incredibly detailed image of 14th century urban life. And immediately your eye is drawn up to this little detail. Oh, I recognize that bell tower. I recognize that dome. It looks just like the bell tower and the dome that I showed you at the beginning of the lecture. But technically, that painting is not supposed to be Siena. The bell tower and the dome were added in the 17th century. This is supposed to be utopia. And utopia is Greek for no place. This is what the government of Siena was striving for. And when you have good government, you have young women who are married off early, and they thought that this was obviously a virtuous destiny for young women. When you have good government, you have notaries who essentially are drawing up legal contracts because there's legal transparency when you have good government. When you have good government, you have dancing girls in the middle of the street. And what more could one ask for? I say this facetiously. There's quite a bit of debate as to exactly what these figures represent. I am not going to enter into the discussion with all of you. It's Friday night. We're having drinks. We need to relax. But whatever it is, they look happy. They're banging tambourines and they're dancing around. And I think this suggests a certain degree of happiness on their part. And then next to the dancing girls in this archway, we have a cobbler. And the cobbler, the shoemaker, has a customer. So economic prosperity is a result of good government. But even more, I think, importantly, next to, I don't have a detail of it, unfortunately, but in this arch right here is a teacher up at his lectern, and all of these students looking up eagerly at what he has to say. This is extraordinary that 7 centuries ago, emphasis would be put on education as an important component of good government is absurd because education was not something that was broadly available to most people, but there it is. And that has become a component, I think, of most electoral races in the United States that's disappeared. I remember growing up and hearing all the time, education, education. Now, the last thing any presidential candidate talks about is education, unfortunately. And up above, okay, right up here, here's the detail. We see that when you have good government, you have growth. The city grows, and you can actually see how they build these various structures. All of you have been to Italy and have noted those holes on the outside of buildings and have wondered what those holes are. Well, now you know. Those are the holes that accommodate the wooden beams upon which the workers actually worked, right? And their wicker baskets full of bricks and their mortar boards as well as they're building higher and higher. So the idea of just busy bees all around, and that prosperity then spilled out into the countryside. And you're looking at one of the earliest landscape images in Western art after the ancient world, because there was no reason to paint landscapes. The majority of the subject matter, was religious, and therefore mostly gold backgrounds. Now instead, Ambrogio, with this very faithful and successful rendering of the rolling hills that make up the area around Siena, and the figure who governs the countryside is Securitas, security. And if you threaten security, this is your fate, the gallows, right? And so very direct, but a very effective way to retain control. Now, on the other side, we go to the allegory and the consequences of bad government. And sometimes negative reinforcement is much more effective than positive is. And I think that's the case here. Here is the allegory of bad government. And everything about it is antithetical to what I showed you a moment ago in the good government image. So that instead of the commune, the idea that we're all represented, the community, what we have in the center is tyrannides. We have tyranny instead. And tyranny is represented as this demonic figure. Look at the horns on his head, those fangs coming out of his mouth, right? I think it's a fold over. No, I just said that. Tyranny shown as this hideous, scary figure with a hemlock flower in his right hand, the poison of tyranny, and a chalice in his left hand. At his feet, instead of the she-wolf we saw earlier, we have the goat, which is the traditional symbol of Satan. And the vices who surround tyranny, okay? And again, this is what you don't want your government to have. You don't want your government to be greedy, avarice, avaritia. You don't want your government to be proud, superbia, the greatest sin of all here up above. You don't want your government to be vain, vanagloria. And I've always identified her as a woman looking into her mirror. And then one of my students brought me into the 21st century when she said she's actually taking a selfie. So in fact, that's my new analogy. And then the earthly cabinet of tyranny, beginning here on the far left with crudelitas. You don't want your government to be cruel. And you see the woman is actually embodying cruelty by torturing a baby with a snake. That's pretty cool. Then you have treason. Right? And treason is represented, proditio is represented by a man with this hybrid creature that has the head of a lamb and the tail of a scorpion, because traitors always seem innocent and innocuous until they sting, and then they're deadly. You don't want your government to be fraudulent. And so this is fraus, this is fraud. And fraud is represented as a figure who from a distance looks like an attractive female, but up close actually has a beard and bat wings and these sharp talons, right? On the other side, furor. You don't want your government to be impetuous and angry. We had temperance on the other side. Now furor is fury. It's anger. You act on anger. When you do that, bad things can happen. But for me, the most poignant of all the images here, for whatever political side you're on, is this one. The D has fallen off the wall, but this next figure is divisio, division. And division is represented as a woman whose dress is divided vertically, half white, half black, with the word sí, yes, on one side, no on the other. And with this saw, she is cutting herself in half. Honest Abe said, a country divided itself cannot stand. And that was a principle that went all the way back, long before Ambrogio Lorenzetti, that a government needs to keep its people united. And then finally, the last figure who sits on the Council of Bad Government is Guerra, guerra, war. War sits on the Council of Bad Government. Sorry. And then down below, remember our friend Justice a moment ago? Well, Justice has been straitjacketed. So the suppression, some might even say the obstruction of justice, is a strong symptom of bad government. And if you have this, the consequences can be dire. And so what happens now, we leave and go into the city proper, where the wall itself is not in a great state of repair because this was once an external wall. So it suffered quite a bit of weathering. But right down here above the door, much has been made about this female figure. Some say that this is a rape taking place in broad daylight. Others instead say that this woman is a prostitute because of the red dress that she wears, and she's being arrested. Whatever the scenario might be, there's a dead guy lying on the ground just next to her, and that obviously can't be good. Over here, we have robbery taking place in broad daylight. One guy who looks like he's wearing his pajamas, grabbing the other guy by his throat, and a third character taking money from him. When you have bad government, instead of construction, we have destruction, buildings falling apart, and people too scared to even come on into the street. See the rubble down below, and the only prosperous figure that we have is the armor maker, the guy who makes weapons and armor, because the rule of law has been replaced by the rule of might, and that is a dangerous thing. And in fact, the only people who dare leave the city to go out into this desolate countryside are soldiers who are armed to the teeth. And the figure who dominates that countryside is the figure of timor, Timor, or fear. And when fear governs, then obviously something has gone very wrong with society. Now, I'm not going to get on my soapbox, and I always say the beauty of this particular fresco cycle is that I don't need to get political. It gets political on its own. But one thing I think everyone can agree upon, and I've heard this from student after student after student for some 20 some odd years, that this painting should be reproduced on the walls of the offices of every major world leader and translated into their respective languages as a guidebook to what proper and effective government should actually be.